Hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining everybody for another Tuesday discussion. Here on Tuesdays, we do take questions or comments either from YouTube, Instagram, or our wonderful Patreon community. If you'd like to join our Patreon community, get in on barrel picks and help support all the content that we do, check out the link in the description. But today's question centered around highlighting brands that are releasing good whiskeys, but maybe are under the radar, are obscure, aren't as popular as other brands, but trying to highlight brands that bring attention to brands that I feel like don't get enough attention. Now, that was a hard task for us. I do feel like here on the channel, we spend a lot of time focusing on some of the more underground indie brands, the NDPs, the smaller whiskeys, because we love constantly exploring new things. And once you do a review on something from one of the legacy distilleries, it's kind of one and done, unless they're coming out with batches like ECBP. If I do an Eagle Rare review, I did an Eagle Rare review. There's no reason to do one again. Maybe I can revisit it in a few years. But when it comes to these new brands who are either finishing different things, releasing different things, coming of age, all of those type of things, who would I bring attention to? Really hard question, but we're going to go through 5 brands today. So thank you for joining today, whiskey friends. Let's kick off the show. All right. Well, let's get into it here. I'm going to highlight the first brand. Now, this one just might be premature on why people aren't talking about this brand. I just think people haven't had a chance to experience it yet. We just released a video about this a few weeks ago, so you can go get an in-depth review of the bottle that I'm about to go over. But I am going to highlight Old Dominic. Now, Old Dominic's coming out of Memphis, Tennessee. This is a cast strength bourbon whiskey. And Old Dominic is one of those brands that for a while there was releasing MGP. They were doing so underneath this Huling Station. I always struggle with that. Huling Station label. And we actually got to pick one of the last barrels of this 44% rye bourbon from MGP that they had left. One of the last 4. Very honored to get to do that pick. But during that visit, they introduced us to their cast strength whiskey and their cast strength bourbon here. And all of us kind of lit up a little bit in love with their whiskey, successful transition away from MGP. On this one, I get a lot of what I would describe as raisin bran, though it did turn into more of a dry cherry as the bottles opened up a little bit more. Lots of cinnamon, lots of clove, lots of these deep, dark flavors, especially for a 6-year age statement. So excited to see where Old Dominic goes from here. And hopefully more whiskey channels start talking about it because they do have some really good stuff. Next brand on the list, I think this is one that's always kind of traveled under the radar, but they keep the prices really, really affordable. And I think they just need a little bit more attention here. I'm going to highlight Obtanium. Now, usually when I pull out an Obtanium bottle amongst family and friends, it's their introduction to this brand. But what they're releasing here is sometimes bourbon, sometimes rye. Most of the time when I've gotten Obtanium, it's been light whiskey. Sometimes it's finished. They're doing lots of fun stuff. But what I do really appreciate about Obtanium is where they keep the prices. I even saw some groups earlier this year releasing 10-year 36% rye bourbon from Indiana. It looked like motor oil in these bottles. And I think the bottles were like $80, $90. You see other brands that want $120, $150 for that exact same stuff. And Obtanium keeps it at 80, 90. I mean, the light whiskeys or this bottle right here, 60, 70, 80, all within that range typically. Love Obtanium. I actually buy this every time I see it, especially when it comes to the older light whiskeys. I'm always waiting for those to go away and for them to stop having 14-year, 15-year light whiskeys. Maybe that train keeps moving, but I keep hearing rumors that those are drying up, so I keep buying. Next on the list, I actually got that in the glass right here. But coming out of Michigan, we got the Journeyman Distillery Corseps Whips and Whiskey. Now, this is a brand that won a lot of awards coming out of one of the awards. Maybe it was San Francisco, like 3 years ago, won the show, gained all this attention. People were talking about it, and then people stopped talking about it, or at least in my circle, stop talking about it. So, love to bring some more attention to a craft distillery such as Journeyman. Still love this release in particular. It's a 100% wheat whiskey, and I do feel like there's quite a few good wheat whiskeys traveling around the US right now, and I think this is one of them. Next on the list, this one is kind of similar story maybe to that Journeyman, something that I think people should give more of a shot to, but maybe it sounds weird on paper, and that's something that might hold them back, but do not hesitate. With JT Melic here, this is a rice whiskey. So, not a bourbon, not a rye, not a wheat whiskey, a rice whiskey. And I think that might throw some people off when they see that it's rice. Do not get thrown off by that. We have had many a single barrel in blind flights that we do on Whiskey Wednesday. And ultimately, I think we've thrown out every other distillery that this could possibly be, sometimes even Buffalo Trace. At times, we get such a pure cherry note on some of these single barrels that we think it's Buffalo Trace. It's got that type of profile, despite being the rice whiskey. So if you are not getting into this because it's rice whiskey and that sounds weird, please don't hesitate. You should try JT Melic. The last brand I'm going to highlight here is another brand that I think is doing some really cool things. But going to highlight Two Soul Spirit. Two Soul Spirit is getting some various whiskeys from all over the country, but then they tend to finish them in interesting ways too. So this is a double-barreled pumpernickel rye. If you are familiar with Middle West, essentially they took a Middle West single barrel and then they finished it in a hazmat rye. This is a spicy, spicy whiskey. Love it. And I love that it tastes nothing like any of the other Middle West barrels that I have tried so far. It is so far down the spectrum on being spicy and dark. And that is just from them, experimenting with this whiskey, doing the finishing. I've seen them do the same thing with Watershed, and they got a lot of other interesting releases on their website. And I've heard about some interesting releases coming out in the future. So Two Souls is one of the brands that is on my list, but I don't see people talk about them too often. So in conclusion here, those are 5 brands to look into. I think they should get more attention. But one thing I do think that happens, particularly in this whiskey tube world here, is that it almost plays like pop radio, in the sense that artists come and go, they release albums, they release singles, those singles are hits, those singles go viral, they get spun all the time, everyone talks about them, but eventually someone else releases an album, someone else releases a hit, and it takes that attention away. And those bands can go away, they retool, they come back in 2 to 3 years, they release another album, they drop another single, grabs everyone's attention again. I'm kind of starting to feel that cycle more and more with whiskey as these brands come and go. It can be really hard to keep everyone's attention, especially if you aren't consistently releasing new albums. In other words, new blends, new releases, new things for people to try. It can be hard to get your name out there. So I do see that happening with whiskey, but don't let that happen. Don't let good whiskey fade away into obscurity when they are producing such good product. We got to help keep these brands alive. And the best way to keep these brands alive is to talk about them. So that answers the question then, highlighting 5 obscure brands or brands that I don't think people talk about enough. If you got any more questions for us, let us know in the comments right here. If you have any brands that I didn't discuss here that you think people should talk about more, put that in the comment as well. So thank you for joining today, Whiskey Friends. We'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye, everybody.
Jeff just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you